My name is Ria Cohn, and I'm the Director of Conservation here at Swaner. And I'm also joined by Hunter Klingon-Smith, who is in the background here, and she's Swaner's Director of Exhibits and Visitor Experience. So she'll be helping kind of on the back end if folks have questions, keeping an eye on things. Our mission here at Swaner is to preserve, educate, and nurture both the land and our community. And tonight's talk is part of Swaner's Walks, Talks, and Workshops series, designed to help everyone engage in nature and the world around us. A couple of housekeeping things kind of before we get started tonight. Your camera and your sound are off. We are in a webinar format, so don't worry about making noise or being seen. There is the option during the Q&A for us to unmute you if you want to ask your question. But otherwise, yeah, videos and mics are off for folks. I want to thank Summit County RapTax also for supporting Swaner's Walks, Talks, and Workshops program. And then after this webinar, I will send a follow-up email, and that's going to contain a couple of things. It's going to contain a lot of the links and information that we talk about tonight, so don't worry about scribbling everything down because we'll send that. That will also contain a survey, and we ask that you take the time to fill this out. It really helps us learn more about what kind of programming our community would like to see and how to better serve you. Just like this webinar, which kind of came from our community and what people want to see. So we want to make sure that programs that we have are interesting to you and answering your questions. This webinar will also be recorded, and a link to that will be in the email as well. So if you have to step out at any point, know that that will be available and will be on the Swaner YouTube as well. And then I just want to mention a couple of upcoming Swaner events. We have a busy week, and it's always busy at Swaner. There's stuff going on. Tomorrow night, we have an uphill ski with a scientist at the Utah Olympic Park, which is cool because that is normally not open to the public without a pass. There'll be free pizza and beer. What more could you want? And then we'll hear from Scott Hodling from USU after our ski. We also have a preschool story time at Park City Library on Thursday, the 26th. And then check out the Swaner website, check out our calendar. There's tons of stuff going on with our Life on the Edge exhibit that is here until May 5th. So you can get involved in any number of ways. So tonight's talk highlights moose, some of the largest and most recognizable creatures in the Park City area. And we see them often in our community and on the Swaner Preserve. They are also more dangerous than people think, even though they may seem like they move slow and they're herbivores, but they can be really protective of their space. So keeping ourselves, pets, and wildlife safe is the goal of any encounter. And I'm excited to hear more from our expert tonight. So our speaker tonight is Dr. David Stoner, an assistant professor of wildlife extension and lecturer in the Department of Wildland Resources at Utah State University. He conducts applied ecological research on large mammals at landscape scales and uses the principles of wildlife management, landscape ecology, and biogeography to inform spatial and demographic analyses of species responses to plant phenology, exploitation, and habitat fragmentation in the Mountain West. He works on projects with topics from cougars, wild horses, to natural water sources and light pollution with partners including the US Geological Survey, NASA, Utah Public Lands Initiative, Nevada Department of Wildlife, and Utah Division of Wildlife Resources. So without further ado, I will pass it off to you, Dr. Stoner.
Well, thank you, Rhea. Thanks for having me. Let me start the show here. Okay. All right. Thanks for coming, everyone. Thanks for having me. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here. A little backstory. So for those of you that want a bona fide moosologist, I'm a moosologist in training. My PhD advisor is a fellow named Mike Wolf, who ran the Isle Royale wolf and moose investigation from 1967 to 1970, and that project is still underway. It's the longest running moose project in North America. So I've studied at the heels of the master, but what prompted this was a project that I'm putting together in cooperation with the Division of Wildlife and USU Extension Swaner Eco Center to examine moose-human interactions, specifically in the Park City area. Uh, so going back a little bit, how did this all start? It's actually been something that's been on my mind for 30 years, if you can believe that. In 1996, I drove from San Francisco to Minneapolis. My objective was I was joining a project in the boundary waters of northeastern Minnesota that was focused on wolves. And up there, one of their major food resources are moose, along with white-tailed deer. And so on my way, I stopped in Mountain Green, which is a little town behind Ogden. My old babysitter from my childhood had moved there with her husband. He had been in the Air Force. He's a pilot in the Air Force. And so I stopped there on this journey across the country, and they told me while I was there, they said, we saw a moose in our backyard. And I was much younger in my wildlife career, and I thought, a moose in Utah? You got to be kidding me. Are you sure that's what it was? And they took out photographs, and sure enough, lo and behold, indeed, it was a moose, which was new to me. Now, it was still several years before I moved to the state, but it always stuck in my mind that this is quite interesting because moose do not occur in California where I grew up, and yet we have a lot of mountainous habitat and wetlands and areas where you might expect to find them. But they don't occur there. But Utah is a really interesting part of the moose distribution, which I'll talk about momentarily. So what I want you to take away from this title slide is that moose, we think of them as a wilderness species, and in fact, perhaps even the emblem of wilderness, but more and more so, they are a peri-urban species of wildlife. And so in the theme of this talk, I want to try to convey that our landscapes are changing, the climate is changing, our footprint is broader than ever before, and that we bring changes to the landscape that make it attractive or dangerous for wildlife. And some species are particularly noteworthy, of which the moose is one of them. So what I want to do is to help the community recognize both the benefits and the costs of having an animal such as this in our midst. So let's start out with some basics. The biogeography of moose. The moose is a circumboreal species, meaning it occurs all over the upper northern hemisphere. They do not occur anywhere south of about 39 degrees north latitude. And the map on the left shows you their whole Arctic distribution. They really are an old world species that came to the New World roughly 10,000 years ago during the end of the Ice Age when sea levels were lower and there was a land bridge connecting the land that we now call Alaska to Siberia. And this was a common route of movement for many animals, including human migrations. But the point is that the moose really is a fairly new resident of North America. And since being here at the end of the Ice Age, when glaciers were retreating as it moved south and east, and now occurs all over Canada, all over Alaska, and then pokes down into some of the northern states. Now, the map on the right is an index of the density of these animals. So they occur in a lot of different habitat types. But what I want you to take away from this are these red polygons. These represent areas of high moose harvest, and harvest is often an indicator of overall population abundance. And so there's this very clear band of high densities of these animals, indicating that it's probably some of the best habitat, with areas going north getting a little worse and areas south a little worse, albeit for different reasons. Now, the image in the upper right is that of a calf. And what I want you to take away from this, a newborn calf, is that these animals are built for snow. This is really the environment that they occupy. It is where they have been able to evade a lot of competition effectively. And one of their adaptations are having very long legs, which is evident from birth. We'll talk a little bit more about this, but they are very tall animals, and this is obvious right from the moment they show up on the scene. So As an animal of snow country, they are the least sensitive of all the ungulates to snow. They make the shortest elevational migrations. And then an interesting aspect also is that as they move south, so in Utah and Colorado, Idaho, Wyoming, the subspecies of moose that occurs there is called the Shiras moose, and it's actually the smallest of all the subspecies. And so the moose are an interesting example of an animal that follows what we call Bergmann's rule. And Bergmann was a early 20th century scientist who made the observation that as animals with broad latitudinal distributions move away from the equator, they tend to get larger. And his hypothesis on this was that it was an adaptation to cold environments because larger body mass allows animals to stay warm in cold temperatures. And this is generally true, although what more recent research has indicated is that the temperate latitudes are actually the most productive. So it's as much a matter of food abundance as anything. One more comment on this. The major predators of moose are wolves and grizzly bears because their distributions overlap almost perfectly. So those are also two animals found in these subarctic and Arctic environments and boreal environments. So they have really shaped moose natural history for thousands of years, as those species also occur in Eurasia. So what about Utah? Utah is quite interesting from the standpoint that moose are a fairly recent arrival here. And in fact, the first observations of moose were around 1900. So at the time the settlers moved into the Salt Lake Valley in the mid 19th century, moose were not in this area that we now call Utah. And if you look at the map here, you'll see we are largely at the southern end of their distribution. And I've got a few circles here that I want you to take careful note of. So moose came into Utah up where I'm in Logan, in the Bear River Mountains and the north slope of the Uintas. And they moved down probably from Wyoming, early 1900s, and by the 1950s, there was a population, meaning we had males, females, we had calves being produced, and the size of the population was large enough that the DWR initiated its first hunt in the late 50s, which is an indication that there are adequate number of animals. By the 1990s, the moose had saturated available habitat in Utah. So you might say, well, what constitutes habitat? Again, we have to go back to the idea that the moose is an animal built for snow in cold environments. There's nowhere in the world they occur that does not have deep snow winters. And it appears that what limits their southern distribution are high temperatures, specifically mean summer temperatures of about 65 degrees. It becomes untenable for them. They, again, have very large bodies, very thick coats, and so their problem is actually staying cool, which is peculiar to us and perhaps hard to understand, but that is really what limits their distribution. Now, if we go over to the map, you see, okay, it looks like they get a little further south in Colorado. This is an interesting situation. The moose are only in Colorado because of transplants that occurred from Utah in the early 1970s. So animals were moved into what were deemed suitable habitats in Colorado. And since that time, in the last 50 years, they've expanded quite a bit. And Colorado has higher mountains further south in the state. So they reach their southernmost point technically in Colorado, but keep in mind those are largely animals that were the product of active management, transplants that occurred, whereas the moose in Utah it colonized on its own. There were no intentional translocations. The interesting thing of late, I've got this circle here in northwestern Utah. This is Box Elder County. This map, notice, is 10 years old. Moose have now colonized the Raft River Mountains in Box Elder, which is interesting because there are some wetlands and aspen forests up high, but it is not exactly a very wet or productive mountain range. And then they also have moved naturally out of Idaho into northeastern Nevada, which is fairly recent. I've spoken to biologists with the Nevada Department of Wildlife, and they have been monitoring these animals. They've been sporadic over the last few decades, but they also have a growing population. They've got calf production occurring. So, interestingly, this species that is highly sensitive to to warm temperatures and snow is moving southward in its western distribution at a time when the climate is changing, and all indications are that things are getting warmer. Now, if we go to the graph on the right, this shows the population trajectory of moose, specifically in Utah from 1958, which again is about the time the first hunt was organized. And this is a classic logistic curve. This is what we see in animal populations occupying new habitat, where they get in, they expand very rapidly, they reach some peak, which is what we call carrying capacity in ecology, which is a limit on the space for this particular species. And then it has fluctuated over time, has gone up and down. This graph here, this is a metric that state wildlife biologists calculate every year. These are, they estimate the number of calves per 100 adult females. So it's an index of annual reproduction and potentially recruitment. And what you see is a negative slope. And what this tells you is that they indeed are reaching carrying capacity, because as crowding becomes more severe, reproduction goes down. And so this tells us, okay, we may have other sites in the state that look suitable, but it appears from all indications that they have saturated available habitat in Utah. So what about life history? Here's some basics. This is, and keep in mind, all of these things vary to some degree with an animal that has such a broad range. But the breeding occurs in the fall. They have roughly an 8-month gestation, which is similar to deer and elk, perhaps a little bit longer. And the calves are born late spring. And what we see with moose is that they exhibit a high degree of what we call synchrony, birthing synchrony, meaning all the calves are hitting the ground almost simultaneously. They have a 2-3 week window, maybe a month on the outside, when all the calves hit the ground. Unlike mule deer, which have a much more elongated birthing season that may last actually several months, with a verifiable peak, but more spread out. And this is a vestige of their evolution in these deep snow environments. So birth synchrony does two things. It has two functions. One is something called predator swamping. In these northern environments, wolves and grizzly bears are very effective predators of calves. Once these animals are 6-8 months old, they're not really bothered by predators much anymore because they grow so quickly. So when all the cows are giving birth simultaneously, it allows some offtake by predation, but a lot of calves are actually immune from it because predators become satiated. It's also, and probably more importantly than that, a function of, in these northern environments, winter comes very quickly. And so these calves have to get put on enough body mass by about October, when the snow starts to pile up, so that they can have a chance of surviving that first winter. The normal litter size is 1 to 2. And I have a parenthetical remark here that about a third of those litters are twins. So this varies among species. Elk, very conservative, 1 calf, that's it. Mule deer are much like this, 1 to 2, with twins being more common or more frequent during good years. So twinning is very much an index of habitat conditions and food availability in a given year. So one of the things, we'll touch on this later in the talk, that the DWR is interested in with urban moose is there's some indication that twinning rates are higher in moose that have access to urban environments. We'll touch on that momentarily. The calves are nursing for a minimum of 2 months, upwards of 6 months. And what we see is in the first year, about a fifth to half of all calves are lost. These numbers are very common among wildlife. They're not really much different from what we see in mule deer, elk, or even some of the carnivores that I've worked with. Um, Life is hard in the wild, and animals starve or they are predated or exposure, various things. So you're looking at maybe half to uh, four-fifths will survive. No, about half will survive to their first birthday. Adults have much higher survival rate. And again, this is very common among long-lived mammals that once you get through that first winter, I won't say you're home free, but you're well on your way. So by the time these animals hit 2 years old, they're good. They're going to be fine until they start to senesce and get older and debilitated with problems that simply come from age. And then they have long lifespans. So they are capable of living to 25 years. In the wild, that's not common because, again, life is very difficult, but similar to an elk. Okay, so that's a brief bit of life history. How do they die? What happens to them? Again, these causes are across the board very common. Starvation is a biggie, and it hits the calves primarily, but also the older animals. So older animals are just more vulnerable to everything that comes along. And by older, I mean geriatric, later in their years. Predation, as I noted, is largely affects young animals. Young, they're small in body mass, they're naive. The mother, the cow, will, in order to finance lactation, she has to eat a lot of food, a tremendous amount of food. So that means she will hide the calf in a safe spot and then forage in the vicinity and hopefully in good habitat. She doesn't have to go very far and can keep an eye on it. But in poor habitat or bad years, say drought years, where she has to travel farther, that leaves the calf more vulnerable to predation. Hunting is a major source of mortality, largely for the adult males, and this is tightly regulated by the states that have moose, so that's largely within our control. The biggie here, though, are highways. Again, we are in an era of rapid land use change, of population expansion. By that, I mean people. And roads are a major source of mortality for all of these animals. It's a novelty. They are not used to dealing with things that travel at 60 miles an hour. And so what we see is that the roadkill represents largely a random sample of the population. There's males and females, young, middle-aged, old, healthy, diseased, it doesn't matter. And then lastly, parasites and disease. And I'm not going to talk much about this, but what we've found in Utah is that at the southern end of the moose distribution, winter ticks turn out to be a major problem, a major pathogen that moose deal with. And in some of the work I've been reading, an average moose may have up to 30,000 ticks on its body in the fall. And upwards sometimes of 50,000. So it's just an extraordinary burden on them in terms of blood loss. And this problem is getting worse because the ticks have a life cycle that corresponds to temperatures. So as temperatures get milder, they have a longer lifespan or can reproduce more rapidly, and we get multiple generations. So the tick problem really is quite pronounced in these southern latitudes. And so going back, this photo was taken a couple weeks ago. I was apprised by a colleague here that she had seen a dead moose on a nearby hiking trail. So I went up to take a look at it. And this was a female calf, 7 months old, easily weighed 300 pounds. It wasn't really clear what had happened, but when I was able to take a closer look at her, she was malnourished. And it turns out that mild winters are actually harder on moose than cold ones because they're fighting the temperature all the time, and that predisposes them to certain problems. Okay, so the basics of feeding, what do they eat and what is moose habitat? What does that mean for them? Well, Moose are ruminants, and what a ruminant is an herbivore. So it's an animal that eats only plant matter. It has a four-chambered stomach, and these are adaptations that allow these animals to digest highly indigestible foods. Moose are browsers, meaning that they eat largely twigs and leaves, stems, woody vegetation. They don't eat a lot of grass. And so the ruminant digestive system allows them to break down plants with a lot of fiber, a lot of lignins, a lot of cellulose that are extremely, the chemical bonds that hold these together are extremely tight. And so this is an adaptation that allows them to feed on plants that are not available to a lot of other animals. So their habitats, we think of them as a wetland species, and that is most definitely true. If we had to say characterize these animals, create a stereotype of their habitat use, it would be wetlands. But they're not limited to wetlands, and this is particularly true, again, in Utah and Colorado and some of these southern environments where wetlands are fewer and further between. I mean, the fact that they are colonizing northeastern Nevada is nothing short of astounding. I've hiked in the Ruby Mountains. There are some wetlands there, but it's high elevation and it's fairly dry. Their activity patterns are largely what we call crepuscular, which is just a $10 word that means dawn and dusk. They are very they have to they have to work around temperature. They cannot handle the heat. So they're out at night, dawn and dusk. That's when they're active. That's when they're feeding. People say to me, well, I saw it in the middle of the day. Yes, that's when we are active. And it's not as though moose are completely inactive during the day, but by and large, these are their tendencies. And so it's important also, a few of their food items. We talked about the habitat use. They eat aquatic plants. I'll show you something here in a minute that's interesting. But some of the other shrubs that are really important to them are things like bitterbrush, Cercocarpus, Utah serviceberry, gamble oak in this part of the state, and then ceanothus. So ceanothus is one that's really important because it remains green year round. It keeps its leaves through the winter. And I've got a secret spot I go to on the weekends skiing. And what I've noticed is that the moose will come out of the forest. There's a patch of ceanothus. They'll hit it and they'll continue down to the river. They'll feed along the river and then come back. And so it's quite interesting how these patches of ceanothus offer a little diversity in their diet. They'll use that on their way between these riparian sites. So my question to you, and I largely answered it, but we can talk about it some more. Is the moose a wetland obligate? And the answer is not really, but again, if you needed something, this is really a unique behavior. This was footage my wife took on her cell phone. We took the kids backpacking in the Uintas last summer, and this was going on right in front of our campsite. This bull was in the marsh for the better part of an hour, and he'd occasionally put his head down and he's feeding on aquatic vegetation. And the reason they're attracted to aquatic vegetation is that the plants underwater are far more digestible. So they are not protected by the same chemicals that terrestrial plants are. They also have very high levels of sodium, which turns out to be a limiting mineral in the diets of many wildlife, many mammals. They need it. They need it for nerve function and muscle contraction, and it's limiting in their diet. So these aquatic plants, because they're underwater, can handle much higher salt loads or sodium. That's what they're after. And so this is a very common behavior with moose, is to feed on aquatic vegetation, and it's unique among North American ungulates. Hippos in Africa are another example of a really what you'd call a wetland obligate. Okay, so with that, that's a little bit of life history before we dig into the serious matters. And so I put together a list of interesting tidbits that you can take home. As we said, the only aquatic ungulate in North America. They are excellent swimmers, and there are even records of them not just wading through marshes, but actually diving and going underwater for up to a minute at a time and feeding on aquatic plants. A record of 15 feet underwater. This is really quite impressive. And as I said a moment ago, with reproduction, singletons and twins are common, and the bigger litters are indicative of better habitat quality or better years, more productive years. But they've also been documented producing three, I keep wanting to say foals. My other business is wild horses, three calves, and there's even evidence of them producing quadruplets. This is extraordinary, and it also helps explain this ability for them to pioneer or colonize new habitats quite rapidly. Because when conditions are good, you get really high levels of recruitment. They have gigantic appetites. This is impressive, 40 to 70 pounds of forage per day. The high end would either be bulls that are putting on antler growth in the spring and the summer, or cows that are lactating. So lactation is far and away the most energetically demanding behavior a mammal can undergo. And so again, it's financed by food. In coincidence, on top of that, females can produce over 1.5 gallons of milk per day. That's what it takes to get these calves to grow quickly enough so that they can survive that first winter. It is the least social of our native ungulates. They are not a herding animal. They're not, I did say solitary. I don't think that's quite accurate because they do interact with one another, but they do not form herds or groups in the sense that elk and even deer. And then, as I said, some of this movement down into these more southerly habitats in the Great Basin and the Rocky Mountains shows that the capacity for these animals to really pioneer new habitats. And then one other tidbit that I have here that is kind of interesting. I read about this afternoon, that their fur glows in ultraviolet light. And so, because, as we're going to talk about momentarily, they are problematic on roads, there are European car manufacturers that have integrated ultraviolet into the headlights of cars. I assume probably Volvos, because they occur all over Northern Europe and in Northern Asia. So some interesting tidbits to take away. These really are unique animals. Okay, let's get to the heart of the matter. Rhea alluded to this early on. We live in a state that is growing rapidly, that has a lot of outdoor recreation. This is one of the biggest draws. And these animals are among us. From roughly Spanish Fork Canyon to the Idaho state line, in any of these mountainous areas, moose occur. And so there are a number of things we're starting to see in these I'll call them urban populations, or at least peri-urban, that are noteworthy. And I think this is an audience that would appreciate this. So let's back out for a moment and ask the question, why do wildlife exploit urban environments at all? There's a thought that once we build things and humans and traffic arrive, that animals will go away. They'll find another place. But keep in mind, for an animal, their home range is what you and I would call a job in a house. It's just not something you walk away from. And moreover, some of the developments that we have made have altered the environment in a way that actually benefits them. There are costs, but there are also benefits. And this is really what it's about. Abundant and predictable food resources. And I underline predictable because one of the main things that we do when we modify a landscape is we make it very consistent and predictable, largely through irrigation. This is true in the West almost everywhere. And we do other things. We have garbage that is available very predictably. Every Tuesday morning, it's on the curve. For carnivores, I'm sorry, there's a mistake here. That picture shouldn't be there, but we plow the roads in the wintertime. which makes them very easy to walk on. Animals get killed by cars, which attracts other animals that are attracted to dead things. The salt that we put on the road, remember we talked about sodium in the aquatic plants, salt is an attractant. As an example, I was telling my students last week, the last 3 times I saw bighorn sheep was not on some majestic peak high in the mountains, but was me jamming on the brakes coming around a curve as they were on the road eating salt. And then again, irrigation creates these conditions that are very attractive. So if we compare 2 years, say 2011, which until 23 was the big winner, and what you're looking at here, the brown dash line represents native habitat or wildland landscapes, just growing on precipitation. And the green line represents a neighborhood. These are 2 points. This is right at the university here in Logan, and then an adjacent point on the wildlands. And so what I want you to see is in a wet year, the wildlands are actually greener. This is satellite imagery. So a lot of my work has been with NASA trying to map habitats across broad areas using satellite imagery. And so this is one of the things we've done is measure plant phenology and compare wildlands to urban or agricultural landscapes. And what we see is in a wet year, the wildlands are actually greener than the suburbs up until about August, which is when things start to dry out. The wildlands desiccate, but the irrigated suburbs have a much longer growing season, and ultimately come October, everything browns down. If we compare that with a drought year, which I got to update my figures, I think our current year probably beats 2002, but within my satellite archive that I had at my disposal, what we see is the suburbs were greener than the wildlands through the entire growing season. So that is an attractant. These animals, they're herbivores. They need to eat 50, 60 pounds of plant biomass per day. So they are not necessarily looking at the greener pasture on the other side of the fence and saying, oh, there's cars and dogs and people, I better stay out. It's, I am hungry, there's not enough food. So these changes that we make that seem so innocent, that are really aesthetics on our part, have impacts on wildlife, creating an attractive nuisance, essentially. I live right behind the university at the mouth of Logan Canyon. I remember the animal control officer cruising up my street one day, as a few years ago, and he says, "Have you seen a moose running up the street?" We saw one. Somebody reported one from the golf course, which is at the end of my street. So it's happening here as well. This is very common. And so we create changes that attract animals to our own environments. Okay, with that said, let's talk a little bit about management and how the state manages these animals, which really governs our interactions with them as a society. Moose have benefits. One of the big things is what we call watchable wildlife. They attract attention. People love moose. They love them, and for good reason. They're beautiful, they're majestic, and they are, like I studied mountain lions for 12 years. I never saw them in the field. I couldn't go out and just watch them behave. It did not happen at all. So moose are quite visible. There are also hunting opportunities that come from having these animals, and they're their interactions ecologically, how they interact in the broader wildlife community through consumption of food, feeding predators, what have you. However, there are some rather substantial costs to having them in our midst, and these are what I'm going to I'll spend most of the rest of the talk touching on these things. Vehicle collisions, habituation, so they get used to people and don't really see them as a threat. They get more and more comfortable being in their midst. And then bona fide attacks. So the state has several approaches or ways in which they interact. One is population monitoring. So the Division of Wildlife spends a lot of time and money doing aerial surveys, trying to estimate the numbers of moose, looking at annual reproduction. They use these estimates to set hunting opportunities, which are by and large focused on older bulls. They're considered what we call a once-in-a-lifetime species from a hunting standpoint, which means simply if you are one of the lucky ones to draw a tag, your name is eliminated from the pool because the demand is so high. It's something like odds, I think, are 1 in 1,500 chances of drawing a moose tag in Utah. And then enhancing wildlife opportunities. And this is the state values the fact that people love moose and that they are really a good ambassador for conservation broadly, because the state is interested in conserving habitat, retaining connectivity, and retaining animals on the landscape in our midst when there are many forces at work that are complicating that. So this is extremely important to them. And then a lot of work done on translocation. So this moose is in the back of a trailer. Some of those moose that get too cozy in urban environments are live captured, they are sedated, and they are moved into either into wilderness areas where there are other moose, or some of them are used in transplants to other states. I mentioned a few minutes ago how Colorado's population started from transplants from Utah, and this still goes on with a lot of different species. But these are the main ways in which the state interacts with moose. And then the biggie, highway and human safety. This is where the proverbial rubber meets the road, so to speak. So the state produces a plan, what they call a management plan, on intervals of about once a decade. And the moose plan it's kind of nice working with a less controversial species for a change. These are the goals for the state to achieve optimum populations in all suitable habitats. So again, the state values having these animals and they want to keep them there at levels that are what the habitat can support, populations, et cetera, and provide opportunities for hunting and viewing. The reason I've highlighted this is that it really is the biggie. They want to increase opportunities for viewing moose while educating the public concerning the needs of moose and the potential issues they face. So that this talk is part of that objective, trying to provide outreach and education to the public to appreciate moose, but also make them aware of what problems they may entail. So as I said, monitoring is a big part of the state's efforts. All of these little icons represent moose that have been radio collared. This star represents the Swaner Eco Center. And so a sample of animals they have in the broader Park City area that are being radio collared, and they're measuring all kinds of things from this, reproductive and survival rates, what they die of, what kind of habitat they use, timing and routes of migrations, and then, of course, as I mentioned, translocations. Well, there are risks to having moose among us, and these really, it amounts to three things here: automobile collisions, attacks on dogs, and then even attacks on people. This is an unfortunate reality, and as Rhea mentioned in the intro, it is something that we don't really appreciate because moose don't have big canine teeth, they don't eat people, so we tend to have an innate fear of bears and mountain lions, but moose can be quite dangerous. So here's an example. This is footage that we took driving home from Beaver Mountain a couple of years ago, late afternoon. And you see this cow coming up out of the creek bed, and here comes a car. Car sees it, thankfully, steers around. The animal gets nervous and moves off the road. But an hour later, it's pitch dark. And you have a big animal with dark fur standing broadside to traffic where the speed limit is 60 miles an hour. So this is a non-trivial part of our concerns about moose. And again, as I mentioned, salt on the roads is an attractant. What you don't see here is that this is a riparian area. So she came up out of the willows. There's a bridge here. She's going to cross the highway and continue on her way. And we have found carcasses in this stretch of the road. One of the mitigating factors are wildlife crossing structures. There's one very close to Park City, west of Parley Summit. This was completed a few years ago. It's been extremely effective. These are really a tremendously beneficial aspect to mitigate wildlife collisions. So what we've seen since 2018 is that collisions have been reduced by 3/4, and 100% of the moose that approached it actually did cross it, preventing something like 60 possible moose collisions just on that stretch of road. However, two things about crossings. One, the benefit is these are appealing across the political spectrum. Left, right, center, everyone agrees this is the way to go. They're proven, it's easy to measure the efficacy, and they are really a good way of minimizing collisions, killing animals, and human injuries. However, they are very expensive, so we cannot put them everywhere that they are needed. I think this one costed roughly $5 million. So it's good, but we have to be surgical. Dogs. This was something I pulled off the news recently. Sled dogs hurt. This is probably the number one factor predicting conflict between people and moose, or the presence of dogs. And so my question to you, why do moose react so strongly to dogs? Well, if we think back to their distribution, the boreal zone, this is where wolves are. You've got the moose distribution, the wolf distribution. To a moose, a dog is just a domesticated wolf, or it looks close enough. And so their reaction is very, very strong. If you take anything away from this talk, I want this to be it, that a lot of these conflicts that do end up in human injury are precipitated by dogs. So this is why. They just see it as a wolf, and that's what they've evolved with for tens of thousands of years as a major predator of their calves. And so they react accordingly. We also have direct attacks on humans. These are not as common as they are in dogs, but they do occur. Most of these are during the summer around two life history events. One, cows protecting their calves. Like we all know not to get between a bear sow and her cub. Same holds true for moose. Also, the bulls, when they're in rut, can get very aggressive. Bulls, they'll fight during the rut with each other, and some of those fights actually are deadly. They'll try to kill each other by stabbing them, the other bull with their antlers. So they get extremely aggressive. And these happen largely in the summer. Calves are born May, June, the rut's September, October. Notably, 5 to 10 people are killed every year in Alaska. This is more people than are killed by brown and black bears combined on an annual basis. Statistically, the moose is a far more deadly animal than a grizzly bear. They aren't going to eat you, but they will use those incredibly strong forelegs to clobber people. In Utah, we have had attacks. No one has been killed, thankfully. And then as the roadkill aspect, estimates are that 1 to 3% of vehicle collisions with moose do end up in a human fatality. So I'm pretty much done here. I want to wrap this up. I am starting a project in Summit County focused on Park City this summer. The project will be focused on estimating human and moose overlap, spatial overlap, and temporal overlap. And we're going to create habitat maps from moose radio collars combined with trail cameras to develop maps of habitat used by moose and recreational use by people, and look at the overlap to build what we're calling an encounter probability model. And that will be something like a heat map showing areas that are most likely where encounters can occur, and then producing a lot of outreach materials that will be available through QR codes or websites working with Wild Aware Utah. So that is what we're doing. It's going to start this summer. We're really excited about it. I definitely need help with that. So if anyone's interested, we can talk at another time. But a few takeaways here. Can we coexist? The answer is yes, but we have to be smart about it. As I said, summer is the highest risk on both sides, the cows protecting calves, bulls in rut. Vehicle collisions, statistically, they can occur anytime, but riparian areas during winter at dawn and dusk are really when the risk is highest. Again, the roads are plowed, the snow is deep, there's salt on the roads, the animals are moving around when we're commuting to work. Dogs, I don't want to downplay this. If you are walking a dog unleashed, the story I've heard from managers is unleashed dogs will go out. You have shepherds that like to chase things. The moose gets mad and the dog runs back to its master yelping, followed by a very angry cow. And it's just not a good situation to be in. So this is enjoy moose. They are a wonderful animal. They are beautiful. They are icons of the high country. They, in many ways, reflect our own values, I would say, particularly for this audience. We are people that enjoy mountainous country, and these animals are a majestic presence, and I'm in awe of them. That's why I wanted to get into this line of work. But they do come with some risks. So with that, I will, if we have time for questions. Evidently, my talk has a few slides missing, but I can be reached through Swaner and happy to answer any questions. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Stoner. I learned a ton from that talk. I didn't know moose could make 1.5 gallons of milk a day. That's pretty amazing. And I'm sure everyone here has stories of moose, of seeing moose, of moose in their neighborhood. It's just such a part of our community. We've got some questions that I will get into here. Michael asked, are mountain lions a moose predator to any significant degree?
Great question. The answer is yes, they are. Well, yeah, in this part of the world, so in Utah, the main predator of moose are mountain lions. They focus heavily on the calves, as you would expect. A study done by BYU a number of years ago looked at black bear scats around the state that overlapped with moose and found that black bears in Utah, there was no evidence that they were eating moose. So the mountain lion is the major predator of moose in this part of its distribution. As we get up into northern BC and the Yukon, there are no mountain lions anymore. And so it becomes wolves and grizzly bears that are the major predators there.
Yeah, super interesting. Maybe I'll go one more question. I see a couple people have hands raised. If you have hands raised, I will let you know when I'm going to unmute you and you can answer your question. But we had a couple people ask questions about CWD, chronic wasting disease. Do moose get chronic wasting disease?
Yes, they do. Yes, they do. It affects moose, mule deer, elk, and it's deadly. I don't know a lot about it other than it's fatal in all cases, and we still have a lot to learn about it. We don't know how to address it really. I think moose are probably less susceptible to it because they're just not as social as elk and deer, and it is a communicable disease, but it does affect them, and it's very much a concern on the part of wildlife managers.
We'll send along some info in the follow-up email about that. I am going to unmute Carol G now. Carol, if you want to ask your question, you're unmuted.
I think Carol's got her personal mute on.
Mm. And if you,
I
I
see a
think
red
you,
icon.
Unmute. Can you hear me now?
Yep, yep.
yep,
There we go.
we got
Okay. Encountering a moose in the middle of the stream. I like to fly fish,
Yeah.
and I've had the misfortune of having a cow join me in the stream. Um,
Yeah.
what do you do? There's no tree to hide behind. I just held very still. Are they hard of seeing? Do you know?
No, no, if I were you in that situation, I would probably just try to create as much space and not be too abrupt with your movements. They'll often go into water to evade predators. So where wolves hunt them up in the North Country, they'll intentionally go into lakes or streams to get away from predators. It's because they feel safe there. And they're excellent swimmers. So in that case, I think, Carol, I don't know all the answers, but I think creating space in a very quiet and calm manner would be the um, best action to take.
Yeah, Dad, thankfully, she didn't have a calf with her.
Yeah, and that's really when you need to worry. When you see that young calf is because they can
Yeah,
run fast too.
we've had him in our yard, and that's not a night you go out to grill.
Mm,
Thank you.
you bet.
great question. Thanks, Carol. Sue, also, I'm going to allow you to ask your question if you're ready.
I actually hit it by mistake, but I've always been told that it's very hard on an animal for people to actually feed moose. I think if that is true, I think that's a nice warning for you to give.
Yeah.
It can really disrupt their digestive system and actually cause them to actually almost starve to death during the winter if you've given them inappropriate food.
Yeah, it goes back to their ruminant digestive system, which has microflora that are specially adapted to the foods that they eat. And so when they'll eat something that they're not familiar with because it fills the belly, but they may not have the microbiome to properly digest it. And then the bigger problem is just habituation. They start to see people as a source of food, and that's never going to end well.
Yeah, great point, Sue. I think we saw a lot of deer, elk, moose feeding during the big winter of 22, 23, just people, and there was a lot of pressure on these large ungulates at that time. But
Yes.
the DWR had some feeding programs, but yeah, not a good idea to be feeding these large wildlife just as regular folks, and we don't do any feeding of wildlife on the preserve. Another question from Dana: at what age do the babies leave their mom? What age does the mom kick them out? Do you know?
So the classic, or typical scenario is that the juveniles are going to nurse for 2 to maybe 6 months, and during those latter months, they're going to start integrating more vegetable matter in their diet. They'll be with their mother through that first winter, and then in that spring is when the young are going to leave, that following spring or summer, because she's then going to come into heat again and want to breed, and it's time for Junior to go earn an honest living. And what we see with mammals, a lot of mammals follow this pattern, that the daughters do not go nearly as far. They'll often remain fairly close to their mother, not necessarily as a social unit, but establish a home range that heavily overlaps. And then the sons leave. They will take off. So about their first year is when they're going to part company with their mother.
Interesting. Liz has a question as well about ticks on moose. Why don't we see them in our yard or hear about Lyme disease more in Utah? I will have a quick plug on that. That just growing up in Park City, I see a lot more ticks now, unfortunately, than I used to, and especially in sagebrush areas around Valley, um, Spring Creek Trailhead. There are ticks in Park City, and there is some Lyme disease in Utah. I don't think that's been detected in our area, but it's pretty rare in Utah. But we do have other zoonotic diseases like Colorado tick fever that are in Utah. So it's good to check for ticks. But maybe I don't know if you have more to speak on that, Dr. Stoner.
I have to say, I think you did an excellent job. I don't have a whole lot to say. I say my mother got Lyme disease a few years ago, and the only reason it was diagnosed properly was that the doctor she went to had done her residency in Boston and said, "Boy, this sure looks like Lyme disease. Have you been in New England?" She says, "I just got back from Maine." And so it was because the local doctor said, "We just don't ever see this in Utah, Lyme disease." It's in the
I
West,
hate it.
but I can't say a whole lot more than that.
Yeah, I hate it. But there are ticks here, so we'll send some information on tick safety and important to check for ticks kind of April through July, as you're out in the sagebrush.
And the gamble oak too. There's a lot of them in
Yeah,
gamble oak. That seems to be a community that holds a lot of ticks.
yeah. Michael has another question too. Any plans to include our local ski resorts in your upcoming study?
We could also tie this one in with another question from the Q&A, which is how will you decide geographically where to collect moose data this summer?
Great questions. I'm glad you brought it up. I meant to actually touch on that. Ski resorts. So what I didn't say about habitat is that moose do really well in post-fire environments. And a ski area is hasn't burned, but carving trees out creates excellent moose habitat because you've got the forest, which is cool and dark and provides cover, and then you have the open country where they can forage. So I would love to work on the ski areas. I have not approached any of the ski areas about that yet, but very much would like to because I think that's probably some of the best moose habitat in and around Park City. In terms of the sampling, what we're going to do is produce a habitat map that will provide a gradient from low to high quality, and then randomly sample trails along that and look at things like human traffic, frequency of dogs, percentage of dogs off leash, and try to come up with some estimates of what the likelihood is of encounters, because we can talk to the Park City locals through events like this, but Park City, of course, is a tourist destination. We get people from all over the world, and they may be like I was back in '96 saying a moose in Utah, you got to be kidding me, and just don't know. So I think that's where it is important to produce some of these education and outreach materials to really get the message out that these animals are present. They don't necessarily fear people, and they can be quite dangerous.
Great. I know we have some great connections in the audience tonight for ski resorts, for trails, for recreation. So Swaner has everyone's email. If you registered, you'll get follow-up email. We can keep you in the loop about Dr. Stoner's research project and share future information on that as well. I've got another really interesting question from Lewis. Do moose vocalize? I don't know if this is from Remy or Theo.
Yeah, they do. And it's a funny thing. Let me go back to my that introductory photograph I showed you. This is in the Uintas. I hiked in there when I first moved out here in '99, and I was able to call in some bull moose. And they make a really deep-throated sound. It's territorial. It goes walk, walk, and it's really guttural. So that's what the males do to tell other males, "Hey, this is my country. Stay out of here." What the females do, I don't know. I can't say. I'm just not as familiar with them. Let me put this up. Here's my contact information. If after the show anyone wants to contact me about the upcoming study and participating in some form, because we are looking for support in various ways, and I know this community is really interested in this kind of work. So I'd be happy to talk with you more about that.
Great. And we'll share your contact info in the follow-up email as well. I know we're after 7, but we have a couple other questions for
Sure.
folks sticking
Yep.
around. I'd love to get to. Nick asked, are we losing moose in this area due to climate change?
That's a great question. And the predictions are that we should. You would think that we would, because we've got an animal that is very sensitive to warm temperatures. And we have only so much high country for an animal to move its distribution upward to evade those critical thermal temperatures. Yet, what we're seeing is that moose populations seem to be doing pretty well, and that's why I pointed out Box Elder County and northeastern Nevada as places that moose have colonized in recent years, which is counter to our predictions. We would have thought that's the last place they're going to end up. And whether they persist there or not is anyone's guess. It may prove to be a flash in the pan. But in the West, moose populations are stable to expanding. In the upper Midwest, in Minnesota, they're concerned about losing moose to temperatures, retreating up into Canada. So they're doing quite poorly in Minnesota by comparison, which is an interesting phenomenon. And that seems to have a climate component.
Interesting. Thank you. And then let's go one more question from Tony. You mentioned in your presentation that moose starved during a mild winter, and can you elaborate a little bit more on that? I thought that was super interesting too.
Yeah, and it's something I don't know a whole lot about. In my readings, there have been some indications that that is the case, but it has to do with heat loading and being vulnerable to illness and having problems feeding when they are overheated. So they put on these huge winter coats, and then winter doesn't come, and it seems to be related to temperature, and that's about all I can tell you. It's interesting that calf that I examined a couple weeks ago, you would not have known she had starved by looking at her because her coat was so thick. But when I handled her, her ribs were sticking out. She had nothing on her. It could also have to do with the kinds of foods that are available in the wintertime. And why that would be worse in a warm winter versus a cold one is still something I need to bone up on that. It's just not it's not altogether clear to me why that is, but that the main factor at work is temperature sensitivity, and that seems to affect other physiological reactions that they have.
Interesting. Thank you. Well, we've got 2 more questions, and then I think we'll wrap up. Dana asked, how far do they roam? Like, what is their kind of range? If you see one in an area and then you see another, is it the same one a mile away, or
Good
does that kind of
question.
vary?
It's highly variable. So the estimates that I've looked at in terms of a home range for a moose could be as small as 1 square kilometer up to 90 square kilometers. But now keep in mind that their range is enormous. They occur all the way up into the subarctic, which is a very different environment. What it's like in Utah, I would have to get back to you on that, Dana. I'm diligently going through that list of questions you sent me, but they're tough ones. So it may be another week or 2, but I'll get back with you on it. I will say all those radio collars that the DWR puts out, we can measure that very easily. Daily movement rates, home ranges during winter versus summer, cows versus bulls. Lactating females are going to have the smallest ranges. They're going to hold pretty tight when that calf is young. And as the calf ages, they can expand their movements quite a bit more. So you see multiple, it's hard to tell them apart. I don't know. They say they're not strongly social, but it's not as though they actively avoid each other either. I have seen 2 cows, each with calves, hanging out together. So again, the social element is nuanced. It's really nuanced in that they're not antisocial, but they don't form herds necessarily. So that's not quite the answer you're looking for, but as I say, I will try to get something a little more concrete for you on that.
And then I think that kind of ties into this last question here. Just somebody Vivian lives in Pine Brook, a neighborhood in Park City, and sees a lot of female moose and not many males, and that there are more males maybe in neighboring Summit Park. As someone who lives in Summit Park, I feel like I see more females than males. Is it more common to see females than males, do you think?
Well, there's two things at work. One, males die at higher rates than females. This is common across most mammals. Males are less risk averse. They take greater risks. They move more widely, so they're more exposed to cars and other problems. So in a population, we look at the sex ratio. Among the adults, you're not going to see 50-50 sex ratio in moose. It's just unlikely. Especially, and then hunting, of course, is very much focused on the males because that's far more sustainable. So there are fewer males than females in the population, and then they exhibit what's called sexual segregation, in that the males and females will use habitat differently. Females really prioritize safety, and that may soften when they don't have a calf, but they like to be, they focus on safety, and that means cover. And they also like to have access to food, but the males are less vulnerable to predation for obvious reasons, and they are bigger in body mass. And so, although the females are supporting lactation, the males are supporting antler growth, which requires a tremendous amount of food. So the males tend to use habitat differently, and then you'll see them in the breeding season. Of course, you'll see mixed groups and more interaction, but throughout most of the year, they will be segregated by habitat. And it could very well be that Pine Brook is good for the cows, and the bulls, for whatever reason, just aren't using it, or not to the same degree.
Well, thank you so much. I think that's all the questions that we have and all the time that we have this evening. Thank you so much, Dr. Stoner. That was so interesting. I learned a ton. Thank you, everyone that registered and tuned in. This is our record-breaking webinar. We have most registrations. So just really appreciate community support on that. And we will send out a follow-up email in the next few days with all of the resources that we talked about tonight, Dr. Stoner's contact information, that follow-up survey. And thank you all for tuning in.
Thanks for coming, everyone.
Thanks everyone. Have a good rest of your night.
See ya.
Okay, take care.
You too. Thanks so much.
All right.